Hi, and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to learn the 2 to 4 player game, Nova Era, designed by Andrea Cervasio and published by Simon, who helped sponsor this video. History has shown us the growth of various civilizations, but what if you could guide your own from its humble beginnings into a sprawling worldwide empire? Could you survive the impending disasters and the threat of rival civilizations? Only one way to find out. Join me at the table and let's learn how to play. To set up, put this central board in the middle of the play area. On that board, you'll find these 5 tracks, and you'll set one of these matching colored markers onto the 0 spaces at their tops. Above, in the area here, add this marker to the 1 space of the top row. Now separate the various decks of cards by their backs. You'll find 9 total distinguished by their color, and these Roman numerals representing different eras. There's also 1 deck with the letter S on the back. Light-colored decks are known as technologies, and these are the personalities. Shuffle each separately, and then collect the technology deck labeled Era 1. From it, deal a number of face-up 4-card columns to the right of the main board based on your number of players as shown in the rulebook and here on screen. In this video, we'll assume we have 2 players, so it'll look something like this when you're done. Any leftover cards from this deck you now return unseen back to the box. Now take the Era 1 personality cards and deal a number of them face up to the left of the main board, again based on your number of players as shown here in the rulebook. So a total of 4 in this case, and these don't have to be arranged in any particular way. Any remaining Era 1 personality cards you return to the box, keeping all remaining decks nearby for use later. Also nearby, set out a number of these dice zones equal to the number of players plus 1. So 3 in our case, returning any extras back to the box. Then add all 15 of the game's dice to this included bag. Within reach of the players, also create a reserve of these 4 types of resource tokens representing welfare, military, economy, and knowledge. And these come in denominations of 1 and 5. Each player now collects one of these civilization boards and a scoring marker in their chosen color, along with one of these Unrest markers, which they'll add to the 0 space of their Unrest track here. Then have everyone set their scoring marker onto the 0 space of this scoring track found at the bottom of the main central board. Each player also collects 1 resource of each type from the reserve, adding them to these related slots of their board. Now collect the deck of technology cards we'd set aside earlier, labeled with an S, and deal 2 of them to each player, returning any leftovers back to the box. You can always examine your own cards, but keep them a secret from the other players. Finally, assign the oldest player this double-sided first player token, or you can just pick someone randomly. On one side, you'll find 2 pictured figures, and on the other, you'll only see 1. And this is the side that you'll start with face up. And that's the setup. In Nova Era, you and the other players will each be growing your own civilizations by acquiring and playing cards that will shape its welfare, military, economy, and knowledge, while also expanding its territories and attracting influential personalities, all while trying to weather incoming disasters and avoid falling into a dark age or 2. How you grow your civilization will earn you victory points, and if you have the most by the end of the game, you'll win. The game is played over 3 eras, divided into 3 rounds each, and each round is broken into a series of steps you'll find detailed here on the back of the rulebook if you need a reminder, as well as on some player aids included in the game. And we'll go through these steps together, starting with rolling dice. Here, the first player randomly draws 3 dice from the bag, rolling and placing them onto an empty die zone, and then repeating this process until there are 3 dice on each zone. But for the sake of the examples I want to show later, I'll assume that we had these results. We now move to the second step of the round, picking dice. As it shows on the first player marker, beginning with the first player and going in clockwise order, each person picks any one unchosen zone and moves the dice from it to these spaces on their player board, ensuring the values don't change. How you arrange these doesn't matter, but if their total value is greater than 10, you must now advance your Unrest marker by the difference. Here our total is 13, so we'd advance Unrest by 3. As we'll see later, bad things happen when your marker reaches any of these spaces, and worse things happen if you hit this space. But those are problems for later. As we'll see, why you might pick a certain zone of dice over another will make more sense as we learn more of the rules. But for now, just know the first player collects a die zone, and then in clockwise order, each other player also collects one, which always leaves a single zone of dice left over unchosen, bringing us to the third step of a round, advancing disasters. Here you look at the dice on the unchosen zone and move the markers on the matching colored disaster tracks downward by their related values. Here we have a 4 black, so we drop this marker 4 spaces. These are both yellow, so we add them together and move that marker a total of 11 spaces. Now, as soon as a marker would reach this symbol at its bottom, it just stops and you ignore any other spaces you should have moved it. Then, once all of the dice on this leftover zone are resolved, you return them to the bag. That ends the Advanced Disasters step, and now we move on to the Check for Dark Age step. These are all known as disaster tracks, but this one in particular is known as the Dark Age track. As long as its marker isn't currently at this bottom space here, then nothing happens and you just move on to the next step of the round. But let's assume for a moment we came to this step and the marker was here. We have now entered a dark age. As you're reminded of here, each player must now pick one die from their player board and return it back to the bag. And then they must reduce the values of their remaining dice by 1. Just know a die cannot be reduced below 1, so any already at 1 would just stay there. We previously saw how the markers of the other disaster tracks can also reach the bottom, but these do not resolve at this time. Those are dealt with a little later. Okay, I've gone and reset things so that there isn't a dark age, but whether you had to resolve a dark age or not, you now move to the next step of the round, spending dice. Here, you flip over the first player token where it reminds us that this step is taken in turns, starting with the person seated to the right of the first player and going counterclockwise from there. On a player's turn, they'll perform an action, and then the next player goes. And around in a counterclockwise direction, turns will be taken. And on your turn, you perform one of 7 possible actions. So let's go through them together, starting with developing technology. In all of these examples, we'll assume it's the blue player currently taking their turn. And technologies are the cards with these light-colored backs. And you start the game with 2 in your hand. There will also be a certain number of them displayed to the right of the board based on your number of players. And when taking this action, you can develop any one technology either from your hand or the bottommost position of any one of these columns. For example, let's say we decided to develop this technology. A technology shows its cost in the top left-hand corner, which you must pay in order to develop it. You pay this cost with a die from your board and/or your resources matching its color here. You'll find this color in a band along its bottom border as well. Remember, this is the spending dice step of the round, so on your turn you must always spend 1 die by taking it from your board. If the die you spend matches the color of the technology you want to develop, then you can use its value to help pay this cost. In this case, we must pay 5 in blue. So we can pay 4 of it with this die, and then each resource you spend from your personal supply, also in that color, adds 1 more to the value you're paying. The die you used goes back into the bag, and any resources you spent go back to the general supply. You then move the card to the matching colored space for it by your board. And during the game, as you develop more technologies from the same color, you can overlap them like this to save space. Just ensure their bottom halves remain visible. Now, I should point out, if you pay the cost of a card by using a die with a value greater than the cost, you just lose the extra value from the die you spent. Also, let me go back to the original philosophy card we were talking about developing, because I want to point out you can even use a die that doesn't match the color of the card you're developing. In that case, you ignore the die's value and you'll have to pay the entire cost in matching colored resources. So as long as we had a value in 5 knowledge, we could spend that to pay this cost and gain this philosophy card. Just keep in mind that although you must spend a die for any action you perform during this step, you can't spend more than 1 at a time. For example, if I had no knowledge resources, I couldn't pay this 5 cost by using 2 dice. In an example like this, I couldn't develop this technology because I'm not able to pay this cost. Some cards will show 2 colors along their bottom and in their cost area as well. This means you can use either one of those colors to pay its cost, but only one. You can't combine the 2 different colors. In this case, we'd pay the cost with either a green die and/or resources, or blue. Depending on the color you pay with, you'll then place that technology into that colored area of your board, and for the rest of the game, the card will be considered just that color. Now remember, when developing a technology, it can come from any you're holding in your hand or the bottom cards from any column in the display. This means once you've removed a technology from the display, the one above it is now available to be developed in a future action. So why do we want technologies anyway? Great question. The main reason is because these will always provide you with benefits. The benefits will be located in this area, and they are resolved in various ways. Many times you'll see a variety of symbols, and the player aid will provide you with reminders of what they mean. For example, this is an instant symbol. The effect that follows must be resolved once at the time the card is paid for. In this case, we see the symbol for the blue knowledge resource. So we'd collect 2 from the supply and add them to our personal area for that resource. This is the symbol for victory points, so playing this gains you 1. Anytime you earn victory points during the game, advance your marker on this track the related number of spaces. When an effect shows this symbol, it represents any resource. So if you developed this technology on your turn, then each of your opponents would return any 2 resources back to the supply. They can be the same or different, and if you have fewer than 2 resources, you just return as many as you can. Now, if an effect like this could target more than one player, you resolve it in clockwise order, starting with the first player. So even though we're resolving the spending dice step, where we take actions in counterclockwise order, all other situations during a round where turn order could matter are resolved clockwise. If an effect starts with this production symbol, ignore it for now. It will be resolved later in the round. Sometimes technology will have an effect without an instant or production symbol at the start, meaning its ability can be resolved any time it would apply as detailed within the effect itself. When you see the effects of these icons, they represent the different colored cards in the game, in this case, green. There are symbols like that for each of the red, yellow, green, blue, and purple cards. And we saw you can identify these cards because that color is showing along their bottom border, except for purple, which has it at the top. Personality cards, which we'll learn about later, have a black banner at the top. Some effects, like the one we see here, will put a card into the past. This means you flip it face down and add it to a stack you'll keep in this area of your player board. If an effect would ever instruct you to flip a die, you flip the value on top to the bottom, giving the die a new value on top. We're not going to go through every effect you might find on cards in the game, but from what you learn in this video and by referring to your player reference, you should be able to resolve any you come across while playing. And that's how you develop a technology during the spend dice step of a round. You pick one from the bottom of any column in the display or from your hand, pay its cost, and add it to your personal area, which represents your civilization. And remember, with each action you perform during this step, you must spend exactly 1 die, returning it from your board to the bag. But developing technology is just one of the actions you have to pick from on your turn. You may instead expand territory. This is similar to developing a technology, but territories have a purple banner at their top. They're found among the display of technology cards to the right of the main board, but will only appear there in later rounds. Their costs are shown in this area, displaying a certain combination of technology card colors. To play a territory, you spend a die of any value and then need to ensure you have the number of related technologies shown here face up in your civilization. In this case, 2 red and 1 yellow. As we saw, cards in your past are flipped face down, but to pay the cost of a territory, the related cards must be face up. Now, you don't lose those cards, you just have to have them. And if you do, you move the related territory from the display, or your hand, into this territory area. And like other cards, as you gain more, you overlap them on top of each other. Next up, let's learn a different action you can perform during this step, researching a technology or territory. As always, you'll spend a single die from your board, returning it to the bag, but no matter its color or value, you then pick any one available technology or territory card and add it to your hand. Now remember, available cards are the ones in the lowest position of each column. This action is a handy way to collect a card you don't have the ability to pay for yet and don't want your opponent to get, adding it to your hand so that now, in a future develop action, once you have the necessary die or resources to pay for it, you can play it in front of you. Okay, moving on, let's learn the Enlist a Personality action. Here, you take one of the personalities on the left side of the board. Now, unlike technologies, you can choose from any of them, not just the bottommost ones. Personalities have a black border at the top, and their cost is shown in the area here under what is known as the personalities symbol. In this case, we see a cost of 3. As always, to perform this action, you must spend a die. If the die is black and its value is higher than the cost of the personality, any extra reduces your unrest that many spaces. Here the cost is 3, and we're using a die with a value of 5, so we move the unrest down by 2. If you would ever go past this leftmost space, just stop there. Now let's pretend for a moment we had been using a die with a value of 1. When the value is less than the printed cost, you must pay the amount you're missing by increasing your unrest by that number of spaces. So in this case, it would go up by 2. And if you don't have enough unrest to pay what you would owe, if it would go past this last space, then you can't enlist that personality. If you instead used a die of any other color, then you would fully pay the cost by increasing your unrest that number of spaces. Either way, after paying the cost of the personality, add it to the area for it here, and you can have more than one overlapping these cards as you gain new ones. Some will have effects similar to what we saw on technologies. Others will often have this symbol, meaning their effect takes place during objective scoring, which we'll learn about later. Others may have a combination of effects, like we see here. This personality is a bit unique as it comes with a token you'll only use when this card is played. As it says here, you place this on an opponent's personality card, and then Cleopatra acts as if she has that card's ability as well. And I'll mention, whether you're developing or researching a technology or territory, or enlisting a personality, the cards you take from beside the board are not replaced. So as time goes on, there will be fewer and fewer cards available. Okay, before moving on to the next action I want to explain, we should stop here and talk a bit about unrest. As we've seen so far, there are various actions that move your unrest marker to the left when it decreases and to the right when it increases. These 3 spaces are specifically referred to as the unrest zone, and if your marker enters or is already in the unrest zone, then your entire civilization is said to be in a state of unrest. When entering this unrest zone, as it says here, all of your dice are immediately reduced by 1 to a minimum of 1, staying that way for the rest of the round, even if you go out of this zone later. If your civilization is already in a state of unrest at the start of the pick dice step, you first check the total value of the ones you're collecting, increasing unrest as usual by the amount their value is above 10. So in this case, it would go up by 1. Then after, you immediately resolve the effect of starting the round in Unrest by reducing each die value by 1. However, Unrest only affects you once per round. After you've suffered the effects of Unrest during a round, even if you advance another Unrest zone space, your dice are not changed again. That said, if your marker reaches the very end of the Unrest track, you enter a state of civil war, and as it says here, you must then damage one card from each color you currently have, not including personalities, so just technologies and territories. Many effects in the game can damage cards, and when damaged, you flip the related card face down. While face down, it no longer has any effect on the game. It doesn't count as a card of its color, and all of its printed abilities are ignored. There are ways to restore damaged cards, but we'll learn about those later. Either way, after damaging one card of each color you have around your board, again, not including personalities, you then reset your Unrest track to 0. You're allowed to look at your damaged cards at any time. Just return them face down to the same position when you're done. This is probably a good time to explain the Reduce Unrest action. A player can reduce the unrest of their civilization board by returning a black die of any value back to the bag, and no matter what its value was, their unrest is then reduced by 1. And be aware, only a black die can be used for this action. Okay, now let's learn the Gaining Resources action. Here, you spend any one of your dice, except for black, to collect its value in matching colored resources from the supply. You then add them to the related resource area of your board, and as with all dice you use for actions, you then put it back in the bag. This brings us to the final type of action you can perform during the spend dice step, repairing damaged cards. Here you return any one die of any color and value from your board to the bag, and then repair up to 2 of your damaged cards by flipping them face up. And those are all of the actions you have to choose from. Now remember, as the flipped first player token reminds us, during this spending dice step of the round, the player seated to the right of the first player performs the first action, and then after, players continue taking turns performing one action in a counterclockwise direction. And this will continue until every die has been spent from every player's boards and returned to the bag. You'll find a reminder of all the possible actions here on the back of the rulebook. And when this step is complete, it's time to check for disasters. Here you look to see if any of the markers from these 4 tracks have reached the bottom. Remember, you resolve a marker reaching the bottom of this Dark Age track earlier in the round, so we ignore it at this time. For the sake of our example, let's assume we had these markers here and here. These are known as the disaster spaces of those tracks, and you now resolve them from left to right. To do this, as you're reminded here, each player must damage a face-up card around their personal board from the same color as that disaster track. So red in this case. You must always do this if possible, but then, if it's not possible, you must instead send one of your face-up technology or territory cards of any other color into the past. So if this was my civilization and I was resolving this effect, it means I would have to damage this one red card that I have. Now, if I had not had a red card to damage, it means I would have had to have picked one of these other cards to instead put face down into the past. And just be aware, you cannot choose an already damaged card to go into the past instead. If you have no face-up cards at all when a disaster would resolve, you just ignore the penalty from that disaster. Basically, your civilization is already a disaster, so one more wouldn't even be noticed. After resolving a disaster, return its marker to the top of the track, and then continue resolving any remaining disasters in the same way. Just remember, unlike these tracks, the Dark Age track does not automatically reset. Once its marker hits the bottom, it will stay there, and you will suffer its effects during every Check for Dark Ages step of future rounds. Its track is reset in a different way, which we'll learn about later. I should point out each of these disasters has a thematic name: riots, invasion, decline, and regression. And this matters because some cards will provide you with an ability that means you completely ignore the effect of that disaster when it occurs. Either way, with any required disasters resolved, it's now time for the production step. You can flip your start player token back over because, once again, starting with the first player and going clockwise, each person may choose to resolve any of their production effects in the order of their choosing from those face up in front of them. These types of effects are shown on your cards following this symbol. So here we can spend any 2 resources to gain any 3 resources, and these can be in any combination of resources we like. If an effect says you must have the most of something, for example, here we gain 1 resource of any type if we have the most red cards, well, this means being tied for the most is not enough. Once you've gone around the table, giving everyone a single turn to resolve all the production effects they can or wish to, it's time for the cleanup phase. Here you advance this marker 1 space to the right. Assuming you haven't reached this scoring phase space, you now pass this first player marker clockwise and begin a new round starting with the roll dice step. And be aware, new cards will not be added to the main display between rounds. Also remember, if you had entered a dark age in the previous round, you'll remain in it during the next round. So you'll apply its effects again during the check dark age step. Eventually, during a cleanup phase, you'll advance this marker to this scoring phase. In that case, you do not pass the first player marker or start a new round. Instead, players gain victory points based on the state of their civilizations right now. First, you will score 1 point for each color found face up around your board, not counting personalities. Here I have 1, 2, 3 different colors, so I'd earn 3 points. At most, a player could earn 5 points by having 1 of each color. Next, score 1 point for each color you have the most of compared to each other player. Again, don't include personalities. So if I have 2 green cards and we assume my opponent only has 1, then I would earn 1 point for this. If we assume they have 1 red card and I have 1 red card, that's a tie, so no one has the most, and that means neither of us score a point. If I have 1 blue card and they have 2 blue cards, then they'd score 1 point. And again, you do this for each of the other colors as well, keeping in mind that face-down damaged cards won't count. Finally, check each of your face-up personalities showing this icon. These are known as scoring objectives. You now earn their related points if you satisfy their requirements. For example, here you'd need to have at least 1 red and 1 green card face up. Damaged cards wouldn't count. Although this card indicates you need 2 green and 2 blue cards, you also satisfy it if you have more than 2 of each. Sometimes a scoring objective needs you to have a specific face-up card, so to score Moses, we'd need this religion card as well. Scoring objectives can also have requirements that need you to have the most of something. And again, tying for most is not enough. And that's how scoring at the end of an era works. Speaking of which, after scoring, it's time to enter a new era as indicated by this symbol, where you'll follow these steps. First, you remove any remaining cards to the right and left of the main board, returning them to the box. Next, check every face-up card around your board. You're looking to see if any of them have a name within a banner in the area here. These are known as evolutions. You now find the deck with the symbol on the back showing your current era and the one you're about to enter. Flip this deck face up and go through it looking for every evolution card showing on your face-up cards, like this one here. Add each of those cards to your hand. These are technologies or territories you'll be able to play during future rounds. Basically, cards you played in previous eras can help you discover new advancements for your civilization that you'll then be able to play from your hand later. After players have collected all the evolutions they are owed, any remaining in this deck after are then returned to the box. Just be aware you do not gain evolutions for cards showing them that are face down, and if these are repaired and flipped face up later, you still don't collect the related evolutions they might show. Next, each player sends every personality card they currently have into their past, losing those abilities and scoring features. Now, no matter where the Dark Ages marker is located, you'll reset it to the 0 space of its track, leaving all of the disaster markers wherever they might currently be. Then collect the decks marked for the next era you're about to enter, Era 2 in this case, dealing a number of them into the face-up display equal to the amount used during the original setup based on your number of players, so it looks something like this when you're done. Now advance this marker to the first round of the next era, passing the first player marker clockwise, beginning a new round. The second and third eras are played just like the first, but one new element is introduced. If you play a card that shows bannered names in this area, these are cards that are made obsolete by the card you just played. For example, by playing Feudalism, the Pillage and Acropolis cards are made obsolete. The game calls this checking for obsolescence. When a card can make others obsolete, the person playing it must declare out loud which cards are affected. Then every player, including that player, moves those related cards face down into their past. If the related technology is in a player's hand, it is instead returned to the box. Be sure to check any of your face-down cards as well, because those can also be made obsolete. If you happen to make any of your own cards obsolete with a new card you're playing, then you earn 1 victory point for each of those cards you send to the past, as long as they were face up. This represents upgrading an older technology you had rather than making it obsolete. However, you don't get this bonus point if the card you removed came from your hand. Okay, with that, you now know all the rules to complete the rest of the rounds. Eventually, you'll get to and resolve the scoring phase of the third round, just as you did in the previous eras, but then, as it shows here, you total all the remaining resource tokens you have, and for every 10, you earn 1 victory point. Now the player with the most points wins, and in the case of a tie, the tied player with the lowest unrest wins. And if there's still a tie, the tied players share the victory. The game also includes rules for a fast play variant where you finish the game after the second era. And I should mention, there's also a frequently asked questions document and errata that includes some minor updates to a few of the cards in this first printing of the game, and I'll link to that in the description of this video. Otherwise, that's everything you need to know to play Nova Era. If you have any questions about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over on the games page at Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get notification anytime we post a new video. And if you'd like to support us directly, you can join our Patreon team, which I'll have linked below. But until next time, thanks for watching.